You say something simple, not dramatic, not offensive, not even heavy, and immediately something inside you leans forward. Not your body, your mind. It starts reaching for extra words, a second sentence to make sure you're not misunderstood, a softer version of what you just said, a quick clarification, a small explanation of your tone. Sometimes it happens so fast you don't even notice it as a choice. You just hear yourself doing it. Not like that. I didn't mean it in a bad way. I'm not trying to be rude. I'm just saying. Maybe I'm explaining it badly. You get what I mean. And what's strange is the conversation might not even require it. No one attacked you, no one challenged you, no one looked offended. But you still feel that internal pull, as if a sentence without extra context is unsafe, as if being clear isn't enough, as if you have to be unmisunderstandable. So you keep going. You add more detail than the moment needs. You give background no one asked for. You explain your intention before anyone questions it. You try to guide the other person toward the correct interpretation of you. And while you're doing that, you may still look calm on the outside, but inside, it's a specific kind of effort. It's the effort of trying to control the version of you that lives in someone else's mind. Because you can feel it happening in real time. That tiny gap between what you meant and what they might think you meant. And instead of letting that gap exist, you rush to fill it. You rush to protect your meaning. Sometimes you do it with politeness, sometimes you do it with humor. Sometimes you do it by overqualifying everything you say. You don't state, you cushion. You don't land, you hover. Even your opinions can start to sound like apologies. I could be wrong, but I don't know, maybe. It's not that serious, I'm just thinking out loud. I'm not saying you did anything, please don't take this the wrong way. And if you listen closely, it isn't really about being polite. It's about safety. It's about not giving anyone the chance to misread you and then punish you for the misread. Because for some people, being misunderstood doesn't feel like a small inconvenience. It feels like danger. Not physical danger, social danger. The kind that makes you feel exposed. The kind that makes you feel like you have to defend your character, not just your words. So you explain. You explain until the air feels smooth again, until the other person seems okay, until you get the signal that you're still safe in the room. And if you don't get that signal, you keep working. Maybe you send the follow-up message after the conversation ends. Not because you have more to say, because your system didn't get closure. So you reopen the interaction with one more clarification. One more thing, just so you know what I meant. I hope that didn't come out wrong. I've been thinking about what I said earlier. You do this because the mind hates unfinished perception. If someone might be holding a wrong version of you, the mind treats that like an emergency. So you try to fix it. You try to correct it before it becomes real. And the most exhausting part is you can't always tell when you're actually unclear or when you're just afraid. So you treat both the same. You over-explain the simple things. You over-prepare your messages. You rewrite a text 5 times because you're trying to remove every possible wrong interpretation. You'll read it and think, this could sound harsh. Then you soften it. Then you read it again and think, now it sounds weak. Then you add firmness. Then you read it again and think, now it sounds defensive. So you add friendliness. And before you know it, you're not communicating anymore, you're engineering. You're trying to design a message that cannot be used against you. Sometimes you even explain feelings that shouldn't need a presentation. You don't just say, I'm tired. You explain why you're tired so you won't be judged for it. You don't just say, I don't want to go. You built a case so you won't be punished for saying no. You don't just say, that hurt. You translate it into something softer so the other person won't get defensive. You do their emotional work before they even ask you to. And if you're honest, a lot of this doesn't happen because you love talking. It happens because you don't want friction. You don't want misunderstanding. You don't want tension. You don't want the cold shift that can happen when someone decides they know what you meant. So you try to stay ahead of it. You try to be understood perfectly. And when you can't guarantee that, you start shrinking your meaning. You become careful. Not careful like thoughtful, careful like braced. You listen to yourself while you speak, monitoring every word. You watch the other person's face, trying to catch misinterpretation early. You adjust mid-sentence. You start explaining before you even finish the thought because you're already anticipating the wrong conclusion. And if you've been doing this for a long time, you may not even recognize it as a pattern. It can feel like your personality, like you're just a good communicator, like you're just very self aware, like you're just considerate. But there's a difference between clarity and self protection. Clarity is clean, self protection is tense. Clarity ends, self protection keeps going. Because self protection is not trying to communicate, it's trying to prevent a consequence. And what makes this pattern so quietly heavy is that it can follow you everywhere, not only in conflict, even in normal conversations, even with people you like. You can be laughing, relaxed on the outside, and still managing perception on the inside. You can be in a good moment and still feel like you're working. And later, when you're alone, you may not even remember what was said. You just remember the effort, the constant adjusting, the constant translating, the constant need to make sure you didn't create a problem by being a person. That kind of tired doesn't come from talking a lot. It comes from not being allowed to speak simply. It comes from feeling like your meaning has to be escorted, supervised, defended. And once you notice that, you start seeing it in places you never thought to look. Because it isn't only one habit, it's a whole way of moving through people. It shows up everywhere once you start noticing it. In texts that keep getting longer after they should have ended, in messages where the original point is clear but you add a second paragraph anyway, just in case, in group chats where you explain the joke after the joke, in work calls where you over-context a simple update so no one questions your competence, in family conversations where you soften the truth before it even leaves your mouth, in dating where you explain your boundaries so carefully they start to sound negotiable. You don't just say what happened, you explain the timeline. You explain your intention. You explain what you were feeling while it happened. You explain what you weren't trying to do. And if the conversation ends without a clear signal that everything landed safely, your mind reopens it later. You replay it. You rewrite it. You send a follow up. Just to clarify, I've been thinking about what I said earlier. I hope that didn't come across the wrong way. It's not that you enjoy explaining yourself. It's that unfinished understanding feels intolerable. So you backtrack, you rephrase, you correct things no one has criticized yet. And if someone does misunderstand you, even slightly, it can feel disproportionate. Not like a simple miscommunication, like a small threat. Like something could unravel if you don't address it quickly. This pattern didn't appear because you like control. It appeared because, at some point, misunderstanding cost you something. Maybe you were misread and punished for it. Maybe your tone mattered more than your words. Maybe you learned that one wrong sentence could change how people treated you. Maybe you grew up in an environment where explanations were the only way to stay safe. Some people learned early that being easy kept the peace, that being clear wasn't enough, you had to be palatable, that being right didn't matter as much as being non-threatening. So you became careful. You learned to anticipate reactions. You learned to translate yourself before others could translate you incorrectly. You learned to manage the emotional temperature of the room. If you were the mediator, the peacekeeper, the one who smoothed things over, this makes even more sense. Explaining wasn't just communication, it was survival. It helped you avoid conflict. It helped you stay included. It helped you protect relationships that felt fragile. And the mind remembers what works. It doesn't ask whether it's fair, it asks whether it reduced risk. So the habit stayed, even when the environment changed, even when the people changed, even when the danger was no longer real. Over time, though, this comes with a quiet cost. You start monitoring yourself constantly, listening to your own words while you're still speaking, editing in real time. You feel yourself shrinking, not saying things as directly as you mean them, avoiding statements that might require explanation later. You may notice resentment building, not always towards others, but towards the effort itself. Why do I always have to explain? Why do I have to be this careful? Why does talking feel like work? Conversations that should feel light leave you tired. Not because they were deep, because you were managing yourself the whole time. Spontaneity fades. Authority softens. When you explain too much, your meaning can start to lose weight. Not because it's wrong, but because it sounds like you're asking permission for it to exist. And slowly, something subtle happens. You stop trusting that your words are enough on their own. You start believing that clarity must be earned, that being understood requires labor. This is where the ground can begin to shift, not by trying to explain less, not by forcing consonants, but by noticing what you're actually doing. You're not communicating, you're proving. You're not clarifying, you're preemptively defending. And there's a difference between meaning and permission. Meaning is what you intend. Permission is what you seek when you're afraid of the response. Misunderstanding, as uncomfortable as it is not the same as danger. Someone misreading you does not mean you've done something wrong. It means two inner worlds didn't line up perfectly in that moment. You can hold your meaning without chasing agreement. You can let a sentence land without escorting it. That doesn't make you careless, it makes you present. And this is where compassion becomes important. Accurate compassion. You weren't explaining too much because you were weak, you were explaining because you were attentive, because you learned to watch closely, because you adapted. The part of you that explains is not an enemy, it's loyal. It learned how to keep you safe. You don't need to get rid of it. You just don't need to let it run the whole room anymore. Over time, though, you might start to notice the exact moment it wakes up. The impulse to add one more sentence. The urge to soften something that doesn't need softening. The pressure to clarify before anyone asks. And in that moment, there's a pause. Small, quiet, not a decision, an awareness. This is me translating again. Sometimes you'll still explain, sometimes you won't. But the difference is you'll be choosing rather than reacting. And that choice returns something to you. Energy, presence, authority over your own meaning. This doesn't end with the video. It shows up later in a text you almost rewrite, in a conversation where you let a sentence stand, in a moment where you notice the urge and don't rush to obey it. And each time you see it, you take up a little more space inside yourself. Not loudly, not aggressively, just honestly. And that honesty doesn't need explanation. And if any part of this felt familiar, you don't have to turn it into something to fix. You don't have to promise yourself that you'll explain less next time. You don't have to correct the habit immediately. You can simply notice where it shows up for you. Is it in messages, in conversations with authority, with people you care about, with people you don't feel fully safe with yet? If you want to, you can leave a single sentence in the comments. Not the full story, not an explanation. Just one place where you notice yourself doing this. Because when these patterns are named out loud, they stop feeling like private flaws and start revealing themselves as shared human adaptations. And even if you say nothing, the awareness will continue. It will show up the next time you feel the urge to explain yourself before anyone asks. The next time you feel the pressure to soften something that doesn't need softening. The next time you pause and realize you're allowed to let your meaning stand. Whenever you're ready to keep observing, you know where to find this space.